Step into the shadows of history, where secrets, scandals, and forbidden stories come alive. In the comments below, tell us, which city are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? Let's see where our viewers around the world are tuning in from as we uncover the darkest corners of the past. Master Silas Thorne whipped his cook for a burnt crust, never realizing he had just signed his own death warrant. He expected a quick apology, a bowed head, and the smell of fresh yeast the next morning, but instead he received a daily dose of ground iron and rot hidden expertly inside his morning loaf. What no one knew was that the fine red dust at the bottom of the flour barrel was the very thing that would eventually lock his jaw shut and turn his body into a rigid statue of pain. Every bite Silas took brought him one step closer to a stiff grave. By the time the story ends, you will see how the very tools he used to build his stolen wealth became instruments of his slow, agonizing downfall. The air in the Louisiana bayou doesn't just sit, it weighs on you. It's a thick, wet heat that smells of stagnant water and decaying cypress wood. In the summer of 854, that heat was particularly brutal on the Thorne plantation. Silas Thorne sat at the head of a long mahogany table, sweat dripping from his brow, his eyes bloodshot from a night of heavy drinking and losers at the gambling dens in New Orleans. He was a man built on a foundation of lies, a man who walked with a cane he didn't need just to look more imposing, but the most dangerous thing about Silas wasn't his temper or his cane. It was his desperation. He was drowning in debt. The fine silk shirts and the imported wine were all a front. Behind the heavy oak doors of his study, Silas spent his nights staring at a forged land deed. He had stolen this estate from his brother's rightful heirs years ago, and now the walls were closing in, the creditors were coming, and Silas needed a quick infusion of cash. To him, the people working his fields weren't human beings. They were currency, and he was about to spend the most valuable piece of currency he had left in the kitchen. Away from the grand dining room, Mabel stood over a cast-iron stove. At 45, her hands were calloused, and her back was permanently curved from years of lifting heavy pots, but her eyes were as sharp as a hawk's. She saw everything. She knew the exact moment Silas's mood shifted, from arrogant to panicked. She heard the way he spoke to the men who rode up to the house at odd hours. Most importantly, she knew where he kept his secrets. Mabel wasn't just the cook, she was the heartbeat of the house. She knew the creaks in the floorboards and the way the wind whistled through the gaps in the pantry. One evening, while cleaning Silas's heavy wool coat after he had collapsed in a drunken stupor, a piece of parchment fell from the inner lining. It was the forged deed. Mabel couldn't read every word, but she knew enough. She saw the names, the dates that didn't match, and the official seal that looked just a little too perfect. She realized then that the man who held her life in his hands was a fraud. He didn't own the land, he didn't own the house, and legally he didn't own her. But when she tried to confront the situation in the only way she knew how, by showing him she knew his secret, Silas didn't tremble. He didn't offer her freedom in exchange for her silence. Instead, he took the manumission papers her previous master had signed, the papers that proved Mabel was supposed to be a free woman, and he tossed them into the hearth. He watched with a cold, jagged smile as the ink curled and the paper turned to grey ash. "You're nothing but a mouth to feed, Mabel," he had hissed, the firelight reflecting in his cruel eyes. "And I've got a debt to pay. I've already made the contract. Next week, the trader comes for the boy. The boy was Levi. He was 20 years old, Mabel's grandson, and the only light left in her world. Levi was a quiet child, quick, with a smile, and even quicker to help his grandmother in the kitchen. To Silas, Levi was worth $800, just enough to keep the creditors away for another month. Mabel didn't scream. She didn't beg. She stood perfectly still as their smell of her burnt freedom filled the room. Silas thought he had won. He thought he had crushed her spirit. But as he walked out of the room leaning on his silver-topped cane, he forgot the oldest rule of the house: never cross the person who prepares your food. The next morning the routine seemed unchanged. Silas took his seat at the table, demanding his breakfast. He was agitated, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the bread basket. Mabel entered the room with a tray of warm, crusty loaves. She set it down without a word. Silas grabbed a piece, tore it open, and shoved a large hunk into his mouth. He paused, chewing slowly. A strange look crossed his face. "This bread," he muttered, his voice thick. "It tastes metallic, like old pennies." Mabel stood by the Sideboard, her hands tucked neatly under her apron. "It's the new flower, Master Silas," she said, her voice as calm as a summer pond. "The humidity makes everything taste a bit different this time of year," Silas grunted, swallowed the bite, and reached for another. He didn't notice the way Mabel's eyes flickered toward the corner of the kitchen where a heavy rusted iron mortar and pestle sat on the counter. Usually, it was used for grinding corn or crushing herbs for medicine, but lately Mabel had been using it for something else. Every night, while the rest of the plantation slept, Mabel went out to the old collapsing barn near the edge of the swamp. The humidity there was so thick you could almost taste it, and it did wonders for the iron nails that held the rotting wood together. They were covered in a thick, flaky layer of deep orange rust, a poison born of dampness and thyme. Mabel would carefully pull the nails from the wood, her fingers staining red, and bring them back to the kitchen. In the dark, by the light of a single tallow candle, she would place those rusted nails into the mortar. Grind, twist, press. She worked until the iron was nothing but a fine, lethal powder. It was a red dust that looked almost like cinnamon, but it carried something much darker. She wasn't using arsenic or common herbs that a doctor could easily detect. She was using the very earth and the very metal that Silas used to chain his world together. She mixed the red dust into the flour just a little bit at a time, not enough to change the color of the dough completely, but enough to ensure that with every meal Silas was ingesting the spores of the lockjaw. Livy sat in the corner of the kitchen watching his grandmother. He was young, but he wasn't blind. He saw the way she hid the mortar behind the flour barrel. He saw the red stains on her apron that wouldn't wash out. One night he whispered to her, "Grandma, why are you grinding the old nails?" "Are we fixing the floor?" Mabel looked at the boy, her heart breaking at the innocence in his voice. She reached out and touched his cheek with a hand that smelled of iron and yeast. "No, baby," she whispered back. "We aren't fixing the floor. We're fixing the future." The days began to blur together. For Silas, the metallic taste in his mouth became a constant companion, but he blamed it on the cheap whiskey he was drinking to numb the stress of his mounting debts. He was becoming increasingly paranoid. He knew the creditors were losing patience. Mr. Dubois, a sharp-eyed businessman from New Orleans, was expected to arrive any day to finalize the seizure of the property unless Silas could produce the signed contract for Levi's sale and a significant payment. The pressure made Silas even more volatile. One afternoon he stormed into the kitchen, his face flushed red. He claimed the soup was too salty, and in a fit of rage, he grabbed the heavy wooden ladle and struck Mabel across the face. She fell against the stone hearth, her lips splitting open. Silas stood over her, breathing hard. "You're getting slow, old woman. If you weren't so good at baking that bread, I'd have sold you along with the boy." Mabel wiped the blood from her mouth. She didn't look up, but she felt the cold weight of the rusted powder in her pocket. "I'll do better, Master Silas," she murmured. "You better," he spat. He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. He looked at the bread basket on the table. He reached in, grabbed a heel of the loaf Mabel had baked that morning, and pointed it at her. "Eat it," he commanded. Mabel's heart skipped a beat. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt even thinner than the swamp air outside. Silas was suspicious. He was cruel, but he wasn't a fool. He had noticed that Mabel and Levi never touched the bread served at his table. "I said eat it," Silas roared, stepping toward her. Mabel stood up slowly, her legs trembling. She reached out and took the piece of bread from his hand. She could see the tiny microscopic flecks of red iron embedded in the crust. To anyone else, it looked like a well-baked char. To her, it was a death sentence. She held the bread to her lips. Silas watched her like a vulture. His eyes narrowed. Just as she was about to take a bite, a loud knock echoed through the house. It was a heavy, rhythmic thumping on the front door. Silas cursed. "That better be Dubois," he muttered. He looked back at Mabel, his fingers shaking. "Stay there. We aren't finished." He turned and hurried toward the front of the house, his cane clattering on the floorboards. As soon as he was out of sight, Mabel didn't eat the bread. She threw it deep into the coals of the stove, watching it flare up and vanish into smoke. She leaned against the counter, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She knew she didn't have much time. The lockjaw takes time to set in, but once it starts, there is no turning back. She had been dosing him for a week, and the first signs were already there, hidden behind his drunken stumbles. Outside, the rain began to fall, a sudden, violent downpour that turned the plantation's red clay into a thick, sucking mud. In the front hall, Silas opened the door to find Mr. Dubois, standing there, dripping wet and looking completely unimpressed. "Mr. Thorne," Dubois said, his voice cold and professional, "I believe we have some business to conclude, and I hope for your sake you have the papers ready." Silas tried to smile, but his face felt strangely tight. He went to speak to welcome the man in, but he felt a sharp, sudden cramp in the back of his neck. He ignored it, blaming the damp weather. He led Dubois into his study, unaware that the woman in the kitchen was already preparing his last meal, and that the red flower was about to do its final silent work. Silas Thorne thought he was the one holding the whip, but the microscopic shards of iron in his gut were now the ones in control. Every time he tried to smile at his guest, his facial muscles twitched with a mind of their own. What he didn't know was that the red dust Mabel was mixing into his daily bread wasn't just seasoning. It was a death sentence that was already locking his body from the inside out. He felt a dull ache behind his ears and a stiffness in his neck that he blamed on the damp Louisiana air. But the truth was much more sinister. The man who had stolen a plantation was now losing the one thing he thought he owned completely, his own nervous system. The study, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke a horse. Mr. Dubois sat across from Silas, leaning back in a leather chair that creaked under his weight. Dubois was a man who dealt in numbers and cold facts, and he didn't like what he was seeing. Silas was sweating through his silk waistcoat, and his hand kept drifting to his jaw, rubbing the bone as if trying to force it to move. "The debt is overdue," Thorne Dubois said, his voice like the scrape of a file against stone. "I'm not here for excuses about the weather or the crop. I'm here for the title or the cash, and since we both know you don't have the cash, I expect the boy's bill of sale to be finalized by sundown." Silas tried to answer, but a sudden sharp cramp shot through his neck. He grunted, his head jerking to the side in a way that looked almost like a nervous tick. "The boy is worth more than enough to cover the interest," Silas managed to rasp out. His voice sounded different, thinner, higher. The muscles in his throat were beginning to tighten, making every word a struggle. "Mabel is preparing a meal. We will sign the papers after we eat." Dubois watched him with a clinical sort of interest. "You look unwell, Silas. Your face might's a bit rigid." Silas forced a laugh, but it came out as a dry hacking sound. "Just a chill from the rain, nothing a bit of bourbon, and a warm meal won't fix." But while Silas was trying to maintain his mask of authority, a different kind of storm was brewing in the kitchen. Garrett, the plantation overseer, had entered through the back door without knocking. Garrett was a man who smelled of cheap tobacco and old sweat, and he lived to find reasons to punish the people under his watch. He walked straight to the counter where Mabel was kneading a fresh batch of dough. He didn't say a word at first. He just stood there, his shadow falling over Mabel's hands. He reached out with a dirty finger and poked the dough, then looked at the heavy iron mortar sitting just inches away. "What's in the mortar, Mabel?" Garrett asked, his eyes narrow and suspicious. Mabel didn't stop her work. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her face remained a mask of stone. "Just corn for the morning grits, Mr. Garrett. I was about to wash it out." Garrett picked up the mortar. He tilted it toward the light coming through the window. At the very bottom there was a faint rust-cold residue. He rubbed his thumb against the iron and then brought it to his nose, sniffing deeply. "Smells like metal," he muttered. "Smells like those old nails I saw missing from the barn door this morning." Mabel felt the cold sweat prickle her scalp. This was the moment where everything could end. If Garrett took that mortar to Silas, or if he searched her apron and found the small leather pouch of red flour, she and Levi would be dead before the sunset. "The barn is falling apart, Mr. Garrett," Mabel said, her voice steady despite the terror. "Nails fall out every time the wind blows. I use the mortar to crush dried herbs for the master's tonic. He's been complaining of a stiff neck, and I'm trying to help him." Garrett looked from the mortar to Mabel, his eyes searching for a crack in her resolve. "He's been acting strange. Garrett said, twitching and snapping at shadows. If I find out you're putting something in his food that shouldn't be there, I'll hang you from the tallest cypress in the swamp myself. He slammed the mortar back down on the table, the heavy iron making a sound that echoed through the kitchen. He didn't find the pouch. It was tucked deep inside a hollowed-out loaf of bread sitting on the cooling rack, but the warning was clear. The circle was closing. As Garrett stomped out, Levi crept out from behind the pantry door, his face pale and his eyes wide. "Grandma, he knows." The boy whispered, his voice trembling. "He knows nothing," Mabel said, grabbing the boy's hand. Her grip was tight, desperate. "But we have to move the dust. The kitchen isn't safe anymore." She looked around the room, her mind racing. Silas had ordered a search of the slave quarters before when he thought someone had stolen a silver spoon. He would do it again if he felt threatened. She needed a place where no one would ever think to look, a place so obvious that it would be invisible. Her eyes fell on Silas's walking stick, leaning against the wall by the door. He had forgotten it in his rush to meet Dubois. It was a heavy piece of polished hickory with a silver top that unscrewed, so the hollow center could hold a small flask of whiskey. Mabel moved quickly. She unscrewed the top, poured out the remaining whiskey into the sink, and replaced it with the fine red powder. It was the perfect hiding spot. Silas would carry his own poison with him, leaning on it for support while it slowly drained the life out of him. By the time Silas called for dinner, the house was vibrating with tension. The rain hadn't stopped. It had turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming on the tin roof. In the dining room, Silas and Dubois sat at opposite ends of the table. The meal was simple: roasted pork and the fresh bread Mabel had prepared. Silas reached for a slice of bread, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. As he tore into the crust, a tiny puff of red dust rose into the air, invisible in the dim candlelight. He shoved the piece into his mouth and began to chew. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the room. Dubois froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. What was that? Silas sat perfectly still, his eyes bulging. He had tried to bite down, but his jaw muscles had contracted with such violence that his teeth had slammed together. One of his murs had cracked under the pressure of his own muscles. He tried to open his mouth to speak, to yell for help, but his jaw wouldn't budge. It was locked tight, his lips pulled back into a terrifying involuntary grin. It was the risu sardonicus, the sardonic grin of Tetanus. To Dubois, it looked like Silas was laughing at some private cruel joke. "Is something funny, Thorne?" Dubois asked, his voice dripping with irritation. "We have a contract to sign. Stop this theatrics." Silas reached out, trying to grab the edge of the table, but his arm went rigid. His back began to arch slowly, his spine curving like a bow as the muscles in his torso began to seize. He looked like a man being pulled by invisible wires, his body twisting in a way that defied nature. "Mabel," Dubois shouted, standing up and knocking his chair over. "Something is wrong with your master." Mabel entered the room, her face a mask of concern that didn't reach her eyes. She saw Silas struggling, his face turning a deep bruised purple as he fought for breath through his clenched teeth. She saw the bread scattered across the table, the red dust staining the white linen like dried blood. "I'll call for Dr. Sterling," Mabel said, her voice calm and cold. "But the roads are washed out. It'll be hours before anyone can get through the swamp." She stood in the corner watching the man who had burned her freedom and tried to sell her grandson. She watched him shake, his body vibrating with the intensity of the spasms. She knew that every second that passed, the iron was winning. The red flower had done its job. But as she turned to leave the room, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Dubois wasn't looking at Silas anymore. He was looking at the bread. He reached out and rubbed a bit of the red-stained crust between his fingers, then looked up at Mabel with a look of sudden sharp realization. "This isn't an illness, is it?" Dubois whispered. The question hung in the air, heavier than the rain outside. If Dubois figured it out now, Mabel and Levi wouldn't just lose their chance at freedom. They would lose their lives. The macro loop of the forged deed was still hidden, and the price of the truth was about to be paid in blood. Silas let out a muffled groan, a sound of pure agony trapped behind a wall of bone and muscle. He looked at Mabel, his eyes pleading, but all she saw was the fire in the hearth where her papers had turned to ash. "It's a terrible thing, Lockjaw," Mabel said, her voice barely a whisper. "Once it starts, there's nothing to do but watch it finish." She knew the doctor wouldn't be able to help. Tetanus in 1824 was a death sentence, especially when it was being fed to the victim every single morning. But the arrival of Dr. Sterling would bring a new set of eyes that might see through Mabel's quiet observation. She had to get rid of the walking stick. She had to hide the forged deed. And most importantly, she had to make sure Silas Thorne never spoke another word. The problem was Silas wasn't dead yet, and man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous animal in the woods. Even as his body failed him, his mind was still working, fueled by a lifetime of cruelty and a desperate need to take everyone down with him. He lunged forward, his rigid body toppling out of the chair and crashing onto the floor. He managed to grab Mabel's ankle with a hand that felt like a cold iron vice. His eyes were fixed on hers, full of a hateful, burning intelligence. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move his jaw, but he was pointing a trembling, stiff finger toward the kitchen, toward the place where the mortar sat and where the secret of his downfall was hidden in plain sight. Silas Thorne was clawing at the floorboards, his fingernails leaving jagged white marks in the dark mahogany. He wanted to scream that the woman standing over him was a murderer. He wanted to tell Dubois that the bread was seasoned with his own death. But the tetanus had reached his vocal cords, and the only sound that escaped his throat was a wet, rhythmic wheeze. His jaw was a locked gate, and his body was a cage of agonizing, rigid muscle. What Silas didn't realize was that his desperate attempts to point toward the kitchen were only convincing Dubois that the master of the house had finally lost his mind along with his health. Mabel stepped back, her face a mask of practiced terror. "Master Silas, please, you'll hurt yourself," she cried out, her voice loud enough for the house staff to hear. It was a perfect performance. She looked like a distraught servant, but her eyes were cold, calculating every twitch of his failing limbs. Dubois stood over the convulsing man, his face twisted in disgust. He wasn't a doctor, but he had seen men die of many things in the back alleys of New Orleans. He had never seen anything quite like this. Silas's back began to arch so violently that only his heels and the back of his head were touching the floor. It was a horrific, unnatural bridge of human flesh. "Get the Dr. Mabel now," Dubois barked, though he didn't move to help Silas. He was already thinking about the money. If Silas died before signing the papers to sell the boy, the creditors would be tied up in probate court for years. Dubois couldn't afford a delay. He needed that signature, even if he had to force the pen into a dying man's hand. But as Mabel hurried toward the door, she nearly collided with Dr. Sterling. The doctor had arrived earlier than expected, his horse lathered in foam and his coat soaked through with the relentless Louisiana rain. He was a tall, thin man with silver spectacles that were constantly fogging up. He pushed past Mabel and knelt beside Silas, his brow furrowing as he took in the scene. "My God," Sterling whispered. "The opus Tetanus is advanced. How long has he been like this?" "It started at dinner, Doctor," Mabel said, her voice trembling just enough to be convincing. He took a bite of bread and just froze. Sterling reached out to touch Silas's neck. The muscles felt like cables of braided steel. "Lockjaw," the doctor muttered. "Tetanus, but where is the wound?" "Usually it's a rusty nail in the foot or a deep cut in the fields. A man like Silas doesn't walk where the rust lives." Silas's eyes rolled back in his head. He was listening. He was screaming inside his own mind. "The bread. Look at the bread." He tried to thrash to knock the bread basket off the table, but a fresh wave of spasms hit him, pinning him to the floor. Dr. Sterling looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the table. He saw the remains of the meal. He saw the dark, heavy bread that Silas had been eating. For a second, Mabel felt the world tilt. The doctor moved toward the table, picking up a piece of the crust. He held it up to the light, squinting through his fogged-up glasses. "This bread is very dark, Mabel," Sterling said, his voice trailing off. "It's the molasses," Dr. Mabel replied. Instantly. "Master likes it rich and heavy. It's the way his mother used to make it." It was a lie, but it was a good one. Sterling nodded slowly and put the bread back down. He didn't see the microscopic shards of iron. He didn't see the red dust. He only saw a man who was dying of a mysterious infection. But the overseer Garrett wasn't as easily convinced. He had been standing in the doorway, his eyes darting between Mabel and the doctor. Garrett remembered the smell of the mortar in the kitchen. He remembered the missing nails from the barn. He didn't care about Silas, but he cared about power. If he could prove Mabel was poisoning the master, he would be the hero who saved the plantation, and he would be the one to decide who lived and who died. Dr. Garrett said, stepping into the room. The kitchen smells like a blacksmith shop lately. Maybe you ought to check the flour barrel instead of the master's neck. Mabel's breath caught in her throat. Garrett was like a hound on a scent. He walked over to the sideboard and picked up the silver-topped walking stick that Mabel had hidden the red flour inside. He didn't know what was in it, but he knew it was important to her. He had seen her touching it with a strange intensity earlier that day. Master Silas never goes anywhere without this stick, Garrett said, twirling it in his hand. Funny how it's just sitting here while he's dying on the floor. Silas saw the stick. He knew what was inside. He had used that stick to beat men, and now it held the powder that was killing him. He let out a gargled moan, his eyes fixed on the silver cap. He wants his stick, Dubois asked, confused. What good is a cane to a man who can't stand? Maybe he wants to tell us something, Garrett said, his eyes fixed on Mabel. He began to unscrew the silver top. Mabel felt the blood drain from her face. If the powder spilled out now in front of the doctor and the creditor, there would be no explanation. No molasses, no humidity, no excuses. She looked at Levi, who was standing in the shadows of the hallway, his small hands gripped into fists. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the kitchen, the sound of breaking ceramic, and a high-pitched scream from one of the other house girls echoed through the hall. The stove, Levi shouted, running toward the kitchen. The stove is overflowing. The fire is out of control. The distraction worked. Garrett, ever the man of action when it came to protecting the property, dropped the walking stick on the rug and ran toward the kitchen. Dr. Sterling and Dubois followed, fearing the house would burn down around them. Mabel didn't move. She waited until the room was empty. Then she lunged for the walking stick. Her hands shook as she grabbed it, her fingers fumbling with the silver top. She didn't have time to empty it. She did the only thing she could think of. She shoved the stick deep under the heavy velvet sofa, pushing it so far back that it would take a team of men to move the furniture to find it. Then she turned her attention to the desk. Silas was still on the floor, his eyes following her every move. He watched as she opened the secret drawer in his desk. He watched as she pulled out the forged land deed, the proof that he was a thief and a liar. Mabel looked at the document. Then she looked at Silas. She didn't feel pity. She didn't feel regret. She felt a cold, hard satisfaction that had been simmering for 20 years. You burn my papers, Silas, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. But I kept yours. And once you're gone, the real owners are going to come for this house. They're going to find this deed right where you hid it, and they're going to see you for exactly what you are. She didn't burn the deed. She didn't hide it. She placed it right on top of his ledger, right where Mr. Dubois would be sure to see it once the chaos settled. The fire in the kitchen was nothing more than a pot of grease Levi had knocked onto the hot coals, a trick Mabel had taught him for emergencies. Within minutes, Garrett and the others returned, coughing and swearing, but the house was safe. Dr. Sterling went back to Silas, who was now in the final, most brutal stage of the infection. His heart was racing, his blood pressure skyrocketing. The doctor shook his head. There's nothing more to be done, Sterling said. The spasms are too frequent. His lungs won't be able to expand much longer. He's suffocating in his own skin. Dubois looked at the man on the floor. He didn't see a human being. He saw a failing investment. He walked over to the desk, his eyes searching for the bill of sale for Levi. He wanted that signature before the heart stopped beating. He has to sign, Dubois insisted, his voice desperate. He can still move his hand. Look. Silas's hand was indeed twitching, his fingers curling and uncurling in a rhythmic, agonizing spasm. Dubois grabbed a pen, dipped it in ink, and tried to force it into Silas's hand. "Sign it, Thorn. Sign the boy over and we're square." But as the pen touched Silas's skin, his entire body went into a massive final seizure. His back arched, so high that his spine made a sickening pop. His hand clamped shut with the force of a bear trap, snapping the expensive quill pen in half. Ink splattered across his face, mixing with the sweat and the drool. He couldn't sigh. He couldn't speak. He couldn't even pray. Dubois backed away, horrified. He looked down at the desk, his eyes landing on the forged deed that Mabel had left in plain sight. He frowned, picking up the parchment. He began to read, his eyes widening with every line. "What is this?" Dubois whispered. "Thor, you bastard, this land, it doesn't belong to you." The loop was closing. The secret was out, but the price was still being paid. Garrett, sensing the shift in the room, moved toward Mabel. He didn't care about the deed or the debt. He saw the way she was looking at Silas with a calm, steady gaze that no servant should ever have. He looked at the floor, searching for the walking stick he had dropped, but it was gone. "Where's the cane, Mabel?" Garrett asked, his hand moving toward the whip at his belt. "I know you did something with it. I know you're behind this." Mabel stood her ground. She knew. The doctor was watching. She knew Dubois was distracted by the forgery. She knew that in this moment of total collapse, the old rules didn't apply anymore. The master doesn't need a cane where he's going. "Mr. Garrett," Mabel said. Just then, a heavy knock sounded at the door. It wasn't the rhythmic thumping of a creditor. It was the slow, steady beat of a man who knew he had the law on his side. The traitor had arrived. He had come for Levi. Mabel looked at the door, then at Silas, then at the forged deed in Dubois' hand. The countdown was over. The explosion was happening. And as the master of the house took his last rattling breath, the world he had built on stolen land and broken lives began to burn down around him. But the question remained, would the truth about the red flower be buried with Silas, or would Garrett's suspicion lead them all to the gallows before the morning light could break? The forged deed proved Silas was a fraud, but it didn't prove Mabel was a murderer. Not yet. And as Dr. Sterling reached out to close Silas Thorne's bulging, frozen eyes, he noticed something he had missed before. A tiny, jagged shard of metal was embedded in the man's gums, right where the cracked tooth had bled. The doctor pulled it out with a pair of tweezers, holding the rusted fragment up to the light. "Rust," Sterling whispered, his voice full of a new, terrifying realization. This didn't come from a wound. This came from inside. Mabel felt the shadow of the noose tighten. She had one more move to make, and she had to make it before the doctor could put the pieces together. "Doctor." Sterling held the rusted shard of metal between his tweezers, the silver instrument gleaming under the flickering candlelight. Silas Thorne lay at his feet, a man once feared by everyone for miles, now reduced to a twisted heap of stiffened muscle and silent screams. The doctor's eyes moved from the rusted fragment to Mabel, who stood in the corner of the room, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The tension in the study was so thick you could smell it, a mixture of wet wool, old ink, and the metallic tang of blood. What nobody in that room realized was that the shard wasn't just a piece of bad luck. It was the calling card of a woman who had been pushed too far. Just as the doctor began to speak, the heavy front door swung open. A man in a mudcake duster stepped into the hallway, a heavy leather satchel slung over his shoulder. This was the man Mabel had been dreading, the slave trader, a man named Blackwood, who had come to collect Levi. He didn't care about the storm or the dying man on the floor. He only cared about the Tetanus that Silas owed his associates. "I'm here for the boy," Blackwood announced, his voice booming through the house. "Thorne, quit your games and get the papers signed. I have a boat waiting at the levee." Mr. Dubois, the creditor, stepped forward, holding the forged deed. Mabel had planted on the desk. His face was pale, his eyes darting between the dying Silas and the newcomer. "There will be no sale today, Mr. Blackwood," Dubois said, his voice trembling but firm. "It seems our friend Mr. Thorne has been operating under a false name and a stolen title. This plantation and everything on it is legally under dispute. This deed is a forgery. The room went deathly quiet. Even Silas, who was in the middle of a fresh wave of spasms, seemed to freeze at the words, his eyes, wide and bloodshot, fixed on the parchment in Dubois' hand. He tried to speak, his jaw working fruitlessly against the invisible chains of the lockjaw. A thin red-stained foam bubbled at the corners of his mouth. He was watching his entire world, the wealth he had stolen, the power he had abused, crumble before he even drew his last breath. Garrett, the overseer, saw his chance for a payday disappearing. He turned his rage toward Mabel. "She did this," he roared, pointing at her with a shaking finger. "I told you, Doctor, the kitchen smells like rust. She's been feeding him poison. I saw her with the mortar grinding something red. Look at his mouth. Look at that metal you found." Dr. Sterling looked at Mabel, his expression unreadable behind his fogged-up spectacles. "Mabel, what do you have to say to this?" Mabel didn't flinch. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her voice calm and heavy with authority. "Mr. Garrett has been looking for a reason to whip me since the day he arrived. He saw me grinding corn and dried herbs for the master's tonic. Master Silas has been sick for weeks, and I did my best to heal him. As for the metal, and look at the pans in that kitchen, Doctor, look at the water we draw from the old well. The master refused to pay for new equipment. He'd rather spend his money on whiskey and gambling than on keeping this house from rotting into the swamp." She turned her gaze to Silas, her eyes as cold as the iron she had used to kill him. Master Silas was a man who didn't care for maintenance. He let the barn fall, he let the tools rust, and he let himself go. Maybe if he hadn't been so busy forging papers, he would have noticed the state of his own table. Dubois looked at the deed again, then at the dying man. "She's right about one thing, Sterling. The house is a wreck. If the land isn't even his, why would he care about the kitchen?" The logic of the error was working. Silas had been so meticulous in his cruelty and his fraud that everyone was willing to believe his downfall was caused by his own neglect. The doctor sighed, looking down at the rusted shard. In 1854, the link between rust and tetanus was known, but the idea of a cook systematically infecting a master through bread was almost unthinkable. Two men of their standing. They saw Mabel as a servant, not a chemist. They saw her as a tool, not a tactician. "It is a tragedy of hygiene," Sterling concluded, dropping the shard into his medical bag. "The infection likely entered through a combination of the cracked tooth and the contaminated food prepared in poorly maintained vessels. There is nothing more to be done for him." Silas let out a long, rattling wheeze, his back arched one last time, a final violent spasm that seemed to lift his entire torso off the floor. His teeth cracked again, the sound like dry twigs snapping in the woods, and then he went still. His face remained locked in that terrifying permanent grin, the Rius Sardonicus. Even in death, Silas Thorne looked like he was laughing at the world, a haunting mask of a man who had died in agony. "Mr. Blackwood," the traitor spat on the floor, "I'm not leaving without my money or the boy. You'll leave with neither," Dubois said, his voice gaining strength now that Silas was dead. "If this deed is fake, the rightful heirs, the Thorne brothers in Virginia, are the owners. I'll be contacting them immediately. Until then, no property leaves this estate. That includes the boy. If you touch him, you're stealing from the rightful owners, and I'll have the sheriff on you before you hit the river." Blackwood looked at the dead man, then at the cold, determined face of Mr. Dubois. He knew a losing battle when he saw one. He turned on his heel and stomped out of the house, the sound of his boots fading into the rain. Garrett tried to speak, but Dubois cut him off. "And you, Garrett, pack your things. I don't like your tone, and I don't like your face. You're dismissed. I'll be running this house until the lawyers arrive." The overseer looked like he wanted to argue, but the sight of Silas's frozen, grinning corpse seemed to drain the fight out of him. He backed out of the room, mumbling curses under his breath. Mabel stood alone with the doctor and the creditor. The storm outside was finally beginning to break, the heavy thunder receding into the distance. She felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Levi. The boy had been watching from the doorway, his eyes wide, with a mixture of terror and relief. "Is it over, Grandma?" he whispered. "It's over, baby," Mabel said. She looked at Dubois. "What's to become of us, sir?" Dubois looked at the forged deed, then at the woman who had lived under Silas's thumb for years. He was a businessman, and he knew that a scandal involving a forged deed and a mysterious death would drive the value of the plantation into the dirt. He needed a clean transition. He needed silence. "The rightful heirs will be here in a month," Dubois said slowly. "They won't want any trouble. They'll want to sell the land and be done with it. I'll make sure they know that you and the boy were the ones who found the deed and kept the house together. In exchange for your testimony regarding Mr. Thorne's illness and his business dealings, I suspect they can be persuaded to finalize your Menham mission. It's a small price to pay for a quiet estate sale." Bubble bowed her head. It wasn't the perfect freedom she had dreamed of, but it was a path. She had used the master's own tools to break her chains. She had turned the rust of his neglect into the iron of her resolve. A few weeks later, as the sun began to set over the bayou, Mabel and Levi stood on the porch of the kitchen, watching as the last of Silas Thorne's personal belongings were loaded into a wagon. The heavy iron mortar and pestle sat on the counter behind her, clean and shining for the first time in years. Mabel reached into her apron and pulled out a small leather pouch. It was empty now, the last of the red flour having been buried deep in the woods, where the swamp would swallow it forever. She looked at the silver-topped walking stick, which she had quietly retrieved from under the sofa and tossed into the river the night Silas died. She thought about the man who had burned her papers. He had thought he owned the air she breathed and the ground she walked on. He thought he could sell a child like a sack of grain, but in the end he had been brought down by something as small as a speck of dust. "You always said we needed more iron on this farm, Master." "Silas," she whispered to the empty air. The plantation was eventually sold to a family that had no interest in the cruelty of the past. Mabel and Levi were given their papers, real papers this time, signed and sealed by the court. They left the bayou behind, moving north, where the air didn't smell of rot and the water didn't taste of iron. Greed makes a man blind to the danger on his own plate. Silas Thorne thought he was a king, but he was just a man built on sand. He forgot that the hands that feed you are the same hands that can bury you. He thought he owned the kitchen, but he only owned the wood and the stone. He never owned the spirit of the woman who stood over the stove. Mabel's story is a reminder that justice doesn't always come with a gavel or a shout. Sometimes it comes in the quiet of the night, in the grinding of a pestle, and in the slow, patient work of a woman who knows how to wait. Because when you treat people like cattle, you shouldn't be surprised